There has never been a ghost story created especially for the adult moviegoer until The Innocence.
Do they ever return to possess the living?
20th Century Fox, which presented Deborah Carr in Heaven Knows Mr. Allison, and such outstanding motion picture immortals as Snake Pit, Gentleman's Agreement, and Peyton Place, now gives you The Innocence. Based on the Henry James chiller of macabre evil. Brilliantly adapted for the screen by William Archibald and Truman Capote.
Do they ever return to possess the living?
You can see. You must.
The Innocence, produced and directed by Jack Clayton, the man who directed Room at the Top, turned into fearful reality by the magnificent performance of Miss Deborah Carr, with Michael Redgrave as the uncle, co-starring Peter Wingard, Meggs Jenkins.
I saw him staring.
Who, miss?
The same man, the man on the tower.
The tower?
But now, just now, he was staring past me into the house as if he were hunting someone.
What's he like, miss?
Oh, he had dark, curling hair and the hardest, the coldest eyes.
Is he... Would you say he was very handsome?
Oh, yes, handsome and obscene.
Do they ever return to possess the living?
And when did you first see and hear of such things?
Why, I made them up.
Shall I tell you who taught them to you?
I won't ever again, I promise.
Shall I tell you who taught you? The things you've done, the things you've said? Shall I tell you his name?
Perhaps the most controversial concept in human relationships ever presented on the screen, with one of the world's great stars, from the man who directed Room at the Top, a new and adult motion picture experience.
Do they ever return to possess the living?
Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Saturday Matinee, presented by the Denver Public Library. Today, we will begin as usual with a brief land acknowledgement, a way for us to honor the indigenous peoples and return the narrative back to the original stewards of this land. We recognize that we are occupying indigenous land in America, now called Colorado, that is historically inhabited by 48 contemporary tribal nations, specifically Ute, Cheyenne, and Arapaho peoples. 574 federally recognized tribes exist in the United States. We commit to disrupting invisibility and ongoing erasure of indigenous communities. We want to express our gratitude for the ability to live and meet on these territories, and for the past and current contributions of indigenous peoples. This morning, we're discussing the lush and moody 1961 adaptation of The Turn of the Screw, The Innocence, directed by Jack Clayton. I'll be looking through the chat to gather your comments and questions and relay the most relevant ones to our panel in the last 15 to 20 minutes. This discussion is being recorded and will be available for delayed viewing on YouTube. Nothing apart from the host and the panelists' videos is captured or posted. My name is Daria. My co-host's name is Andrew. Message us directly, say hello, or if you're having technical issues, we'll do our very best to help you out. And now, give your warmest welcome to the film critic Walter Chaw and the award-winning writer and director, Rob Savage.
Hey, good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today on such a warm and sunny day for such a cold and chilly Victorian Gothic. A few things. First, I would love for my epitaph to be handsome and obscene. That's on my gravestone. And when my kids come visit one day, that'll be what it says: Walter Chaw, beloved father, handsome and obscene. But I want to go very briefly over a few topics, and then we're going to pull Rob into this conversation. starting with the Gothic tradition in British literature. And it begins all the way back in 1764 with Horace Walpole. He wrote a book called The Castle of Otranto, and subtitled it A Gothic Story. And he meant that sort of as a joke. He meant that to sort of imply that his book was a translation from an old, creepy 16th century Italian text that he'd unearthed somewhere. It wasn't that. It was sort of an affectation, but Gothic meant to convey all of those elements of barbarity and medieval sin, if you will. The great Anne Radcliffe took on this tradition with a book she wrote called The Mysteries of Udolpho from the 1794. Udolpho is the name of this huge castle in which this decaying aristocrat named Montoni has sequestered away a young virgin heroine named Emily and subjects her to unspeakable terrors and frights within those walls. Now, Radcliffe, as she was writing, she made all of these supernatural goings on figments of the heroine's imagination. There were psychological things. And it was the thing that the Romanticists, when they began to take on the mantle of some of these Gothic trappings, including Coleridge, especially with all the ghosts that appear in his poetry, he was really critical of Radcliffe and said, you know what, she didn't quite have the muscle to go all the way with the supernatural. All of these were sort of like these psychological underpinnings. But I would argue that sometimes that's even more powerful, and that leads right into our conversation about the Innocents today. During the Romanticist era as well, Jane Austen wrote a satire of the Gothic romance called Northanger Abbey, in which her heroine in that book, Catherine, is obsessed with Gothic romances, and so it bleeds into how she perceives the everyday surroundings. When you read Henry James's short story, The Turn of the Screw, the main character in that short story, the governess, is also obsessed with Gothic novels. And so here are the seeds that are planted in the Gothic tradition about various ways that we can read the Innocents. Other examples, a great example of the Gothic is Matthew Lewis's The Monk from 1796. If you've never read The Monk, it is as vital and contemporary as Paul Verhoeven's new Naughty Nun movie. It is full of ghosts and demons and really horny monks, as if there were any other kind. And at the end of it, Satan actually appears as a character in the book. So if you've not read, spoiler alert, but it's the book is quite old. You should have read it by now, but you should read The Monk if you haven't, by Matthew Lewis. Other grand examples, of course, another Jane Austen contemporary, Mary Shelley, wrote a book called Frankenstein, which you may have heard of before. Dracula is an example of the Gothic tradition. Robert Louis Stevenson's Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde introduces this other element of the Gothic, which is that of the double or of doubling. Charles Dickens liked that as well. But there's also a novel you may not have read by James Hogg called The Private Memoirs and Confessions of a Justified Sinner from 1824. It's a story about a guy who's actually being pursued by his villainous shadow, his double. Read that as well if you haven't. The works of Edgar Allan Poe, Sheridan Le Fanu, Wilkie Collins, Wuthering Heights, one of my all-time favorites, is steeped in the supernatural and the deep Gothic. Jane Eyre, which was made into a wonderful horror film called I Walked with a Zombie by Val Lewton in the 1940s. And another great example of the Gothic. Britney Spears' Conservatorship, an example of the Gothic. Crimson Peak, an example of the Gothic. So all these things lead us to, strangely enough, a World War II documentary called Naples is a Battlefield from 1944. It's one of many propaganda pieces developed by the Allies during this period of time. Both sides were making little propaganda documentaries. Hitchcock made one about the Holocaust. But in Naples, where this young guy named Jack Clayton was, he worked his way up in the film studio in Britain. He'd started out as a tea boy, the equivalent of a coffee kid, I guess, in the United States. And he had become sort of assistant director, assistant producer. He did this little short documentary in Naples, but also in Naples, he met a guy named John Huston. And later, when Jack Clayton made a couple of films in Britain, he came to the United States and he collaborated with John Huston, the great American filmmaker, which we saw as an actor in Chinatown a few weeks ago. He collaborated with John Huston on a movie called Beat the Devil, starring Humphrey Bogart and Jennifer Jones and Gina Lollobrigida. If you have not seen, and Peter Lorre's in it too, I think at some point, if you've not seen Beat the Devil, you should, because it was not only directed by John Huston, it was written by Truman Capote, the American author, best friend of Harper Lee, the author of In Cold Blood, and they kind of improvised the film in a way. They were writing the script at night over a prodigious amount of alcohol to be shot the next morning. So they write a page at night and they shoot the next day. So Beat the Devil is this really strange, sort of spoofy, fascinating film, called by some to be the by Roger Ebert to be the first cult film, the first camp film. So see Beat the Devil, because not only is it fascinating, it's where Jack Clayton, who was an associate producer, met Freddie Francis, who was the camera operator for that film. It's also where he got in contact with Truman Capote. So when it came time for Jack Clayton to choose his second film, it's going to be this adaptation of a stage play by William Archibald called The Innocence, which was an adaptation of Henry James's The Turn of the Screw. So Jack Clayton gets a screenplay from William Archibald, and it's like, it's not quite right. I'm not sure that I love it. He brings in people like Harold Pinter, who's a buddy of his. I guess they just hung out. I can't imagine that. But he brings in Harold Pinter, and Pinter says, I don't like the backstory. I don't like it to be so explicit. Let's cut out this part where they leave the castle, the Gothic, the crumbling structure, the Gothic mansion. Let's cut out the part where they ever leave it after the beginning. We'll open somewhere else, but once she gets there, she's there. So Pinter had good things to contribute. Finally, Clayton's like, you know what we really need for a film about weird sex and perverse governesses? We need Truman Capote. And they did. So they brought him in. Truman Capote rewrote the whole thing. He's credited with about 90% of what's there. And it's remarkable. And then he said, you know what? I need Freddie Francis, because the studio wants me to shoot this in CinemaScope and it's really wide. I'm not comfortable with that. I like the small screen, but if that's what they want, then I'm going to bring in Freddie Francis, because he's just won an Oscar for shooting in this really, really wide scope. So he brought in the cinematographer. So Beat the Devil is actually sort of the extended origin story for The Innocence. It wouldn't have come about without that weird film. The last person I'll talk about before we introduce Rob is Deborah Kerr, one of my all-time favorite actresses from this period of Hollywood and the UK. She was in 2 Powell Pressburger films, 3, but she was cut out of the first one. But the 2 that exist with her in it are all-time masterpieces of world cinema. The Life and Death of Colonel Blimp from 1943, in which Deborah Kerr plays 3 different characters. Really amazing. I think no hyperbole does it justice. Neither does the follow-up with Powell and Pressburger, Black Narcissus, which is the root of all of these sort of nunsploitation horror films. And even the Giallo, I think, owes a lot to Black Narcissus. So if you've not seen The Life and Death of Colonel Blimp and Black Narcissus, you have your homework for next week when we're not on. They're incredible. Of course, she's the one that shares a lustful kiss in the surf with Burt Lancaster From Here to Eternity. She is in The Grass is Greener. Heaven knows, Mr. Allison. I love the trailer where they're talking about, like, she was in Peyton Place and now The Innocence, weird sex. She was in Night of the Iguana, which is really fascinating as well. If you've not seen it, a great Tennessee Williams adaptation. She was with Robert Mitchum in The Sundowners. She was with Gary Cooper, I think his last film, the Naked Edge. She's one of the all-timers, and she was described at one point as an actress who doesn't just say her words, she thinks them. And I think we see that throughout The Innocence. Now, we'll talk more about Truman Capote with Rob, because Rob knows all about weird sex. I first heard about Rob Savage when I saw a short film out of Fantasia Fest, I think, a few years ago, and it's called Salt. And Salt is actually going to be the short film that we watch at the end of our presentation today. It's only 2 minutes long. That 2 minutes was one of the best movies I had seen that year. It remains one of the best fantasy films that I've seen, fantasy horror films that I've ever seen. In 2 minutes time, this kid, really, damn you, made a movie that tells a complete story about a world, a complete story about a mother and her daughter. It's done brilliantly through edits. It's done brilliantly through the way that he sets the stage. The production design is incandescently brilliant. He gets a great monster performance by James Swanton, who is one of the undiscovered talents in the world. I think he's due. There is so much to love about it, and I think I said at the time someone needs to give him, this guy, whoever this guy is, Rob Savage, that can't be a real name. They've got to give him all the money to make a feature film. Well, over the pandemic, he made a feature-length film. He had made one earlier called Strings, which I like, but not exactly a horror film. And over the pandemic, he made a feature-length, almost feature-length. It's a long short or a short feature for Shudder, the online streaming service, called Host. Not to be confused with the giant Mudskipper film, which is also great. But Host is a Zoom horror film in which a group of friends get together and have a seance over Zoom. Don't ever have a seance, and especially not over Zoom. And it sort of was spawned, I think, by a prank that he played on his friends over a Zoom talk, where he pretended to hear something up in the attic, and he goes up there and something terrible happens. I think it's still on YouTube. It went a little bit viral. You should go look at it, because it's magnificent for its cruelty. And from that comes Host, and Host is amazing. Of course it's amazing. I knew it was going to be amazing. I called it, man. It's extraordinary. And from that, he's on his way, man. He's going to make several more movies that we won't talk about today, but we'll talk about somewhere else down the road. Without further ado, it's my great pleasure to welcome Rob Savage. Rob, thanks for chiming in.
Hey, thanks so much, Walter. So great to be here.
So why the Innocence?
Well, I think if somebody was to put a gun to my head, if a gun just came into frame right now and went to my head and asked me what I think the best movie ever made is, I think probably the first words to come out of my mouth would be The Innocence, which I know is big talk, but I think it's the movie that I watch it at least once or twice a year. Every time I watch it, I'm just struck by the craft, the artistry, the subtext, the writing, the performances. It just kind of exemplifies everything I love about movies. It's the best horror movie ever made. It's a movie that's just so strikingly modern, which is something that I love, because I think, there's this handful of movies, especially in the horror genre. I think it's specific to horror in a way, because horror is such a kind of pure form of cinema. But like, I remember so vividly watching The Innocence for the first time, and I was a teenager, but I was already kind of into, making ketchup blood slasher movies with my friends. And I was just trying to watch as much as possible. And me and my friends, we were trying to come up with a haunted house idea. So we were just trying to watch everything we could. And I put on The Innocence, and I was just kind of settled down into it, thinking, okay, I've got to put on my 1960s goggles to watch this. I've got to watch it within the context of when there's going to be this booming orchestral score. It's going to be over the top. It's not going to scare me. I watched it. It was the middle of the night. All the lights were off. I'd taken no precautions, and the hide and seek scene happens, and you get your first glimpse of Quint, and I just remember having this feeling of like, fuck, like I'm not prepared for this. Like I've kind of just blindly wandered into this movie, not knowing anything about it, and it's probably going to fuck me up, and it did in a wonderful way. And I've kind of returned to it every time I can see it on the big screen, especially because Freddie Francis cinematography, I think, is some of the best of any movie. It's one of the best photographed movies of all time. And I watched it again last night. We were just talking about it, and there's new things that I picked up. There's new technical wizardry that I hadn't noticed that just blows my mind all over again. So it's a movie that it feels fresh every time.
Well, just that hide and seek sequence that you're talking about, and you're talking about how modern it feels and everything, that the way that it's edited by Jim Clark, the way that it's shot by Francis, the way that it's directed and performed. Talk to me a little bit about the technical mastery of that movie, including like shooting from above and she's spinning, and the the close-ups and the split diopter. Tell me about those things that you notice.
The thing, I mean, it's an interesting one because I was doing some reading. I read this bit. It was on the Criterion page from Freddie Francis's memoirs, talking about shooting the movie, and it's kind of made me think about this film. When we spoke about Host, we were talking about it. Like Host is very much a film that's authored by all the people who contributed to it, and I think this film is authored so much by Pote, by Clayton, but so much by Freddie Francis. And I was reading about his Jack Clayton wanting to shoot it 4:3 originally. And actually, it was Freddie Francis who was like, the studio aren't going to let you do that. Come on. So like, even as he was having those conversations with Jack, it sounded, from from Freddie's memoir, and I'm sure this is how he spins it, but he was talking about how he kind of kept CinemaScope in the back of his mind and tried to think in those terms and tried to imagine this story as something more expansive. And so, you know, and when I read that, it kind of blew my mind, because it's a movie that uses the widescreen frame so amazingly. And the thing that I always bring it up whenever I'm talking about horror, because it does something that I think every good horror filmmaker does, is that it kind of sets the rules and the parameters for how you're going to scare the audience. Like you can be, you know, Friday the 13th Part 3 and have heads lopped off and you can be operating at that level, or you can be Paranormal Activity and have the slightest movement of the door make an audience scream. You kind of have to set the parameters of how you're going to scare the audience so that they can kind of click into the movie. And it does this wonderful thing. Where you're there, you're behind the curtain with Deborah, and you've got this whole widescreen frame. She's off here, and you've got the expanse of the garden out the windows, and your eyes are kind of scanning around, and they're holding the shot, and suddenly you see this face emerge from the shadows, and there's no musical hit. The camera doesn't crash zoom into it. It's just something that happens incidentally within the frame that your eyes find, and it jolts you awake, and you realize that, fuck, this guy Jack Clayton, he's not going to tell me when a scare is coming. He's not going to underline it. He's not going to guide my eye there in a kind of traditional way. So I've got to be alert this whole movie. I've got to always be searching the shadows. I've always got to be searching the frame, because nothing is safe anymore. All the things, all the kind of like elements of genre, and even like the movies of that time, he's not playing with. He's not fucking around, and he's using absence. He's using silence actually to underline a lot of these scares, which is why that scene specifically feels so modern, because it's such a kind of and I watch it in the cinema, and there's just this intake of breath from the audience that you feel as everyone spots it at the same time, and it's it's so incredibly modern and so well thought out.
Well, I love when you say that he trains the audience, Francis and Clayton do, about how to look, because the very first entrance of the governess of Miss Giddens into this environment, is this 2.5 minute extended shot, where he's being followed right through the foyer, and she knocks some petals off the roses. Oh, I'm terribly sorry. Happens all the time, And then she goes into the main room, and you see the little girl exiting from one side of it. And she comes all the way around. You can see her in the window in the back. She's been sent out because she's not allowed to have the tortoise in. Yeah. And you can see her re-entering as soon as the maid leaves. As soon as Mrs. Gross leaves the room, she says, "Is she gone now?" And she comes back in, but you can see her in the back. And so you're trained now to be looking in the background and looking at the sides where the characters are not, so that at the end of it, when everything starts getting real in there, you, to your point, are searching the frame. You've been trained to see the whole frame. What they don't see, you are now forced to see. Exactly. And it's like it's so essential as well, setting up the geography of the place. He does that so well, and that's something that a lot of modern horror filmmakers really fall down in. It's just setting up it's action movies, it's horror movies, anything where you're going to have something visceral and frenetic happen later. You just want to know exactly where you are, and it's they shoot the whole thing in this gorgeous deep focus, so almost everything is pin sharp, and you're always looking at what the point of focus is. And like he's kind of, I just love how purposeful the movie is. Everything about it. It's it's one of those things where there are certain filmmakers, and Spielberg does this. It's like, there's a great video online about the way that Spielberg does these kind of invisible long takes that just leads your eye exactly where you need to be. And it's just pure storytelling. There's something so nice about sitting in a cinema and being like, oh, they've got me. This is fine. I'm exactly where I need to be for every moment. And he moves the camera. He's never showing off, and he always moves the camera to be in exactly where it needs to be, so effortlessly. It's almost in a dance with the actors. And Spielberg was deeply influenced by Clayton, especially a movie called Our Mother's House, which he did, two movies after The Innocents. So he had this little period. I'm sure that where his first movie was Room at the Top, which is very good. It's a very strong film, and then he does The Innocents, amazing, and then he follows it with The Pumpkin Eater, which is, I think, the best Anne Bancroft movie performance ever. It's like she's like Mrs. Robinson again, but you get her backstory now, and you get more of like the unhappy marriage in a way. She's remarkable in it. I think Peter Finch is her husband in that, and then Our Mother's House, which is sort of the predecessor to this Gothic V.C. Andrews sort of thing, the really religious Carrie-like mother who dies and leaves her 5 kids who have been emotionally stunted. It's like Dogtooth in a way from 1967. And Spielberg had the cast of the Color Purple and everybody watch it before he shot that movie. So Spielberg is a huge thing. So I love that you mentioned that. And it's so influential in so many ways. But the idea of geography, I want to touch on a little bit, because we also covered the Heiress, the William Wyler, the great William Wyler film, as part of this program, which is based on another Truman Capote. And so the story of architecture and the story of place in the Heiress is as distinct and compelling a character as it is in The Innocents. And I think we find as The Innocents goes on that the geography becomes confused, almost expressionistic, right? Can you talk a little bit about how this movie, to a large extent, feels like a projection of Miss Giddens's? Yeah.
Well, I think it's interesting. I didn't know that like you were talking about the origin of the script, and originally, this plan to have a scene where they leave, and there was a funeral scene, I think, that they shot at the end where she goes to the kid's funeral and comes back, and like the kind of the claustrophobia of this movie, for a movie that's such a beautiful widescreen film, is so striking. And there's something about films that just say, this is our playground, we're going to stay here, and you're stuck, you're here shoulder to shoulder with these characters as long as they are for the whole runtime. And there's something so intense about that. Like my favorite subgenre of anything is like the siege movie. It's like Assault on Precinct 13, or movies where the characters being forced back into the corner of this oppressive space. And I think it's interesting. It's interesting the way that he uses the space, just knowing, just cinematographically knowing that his desire to shoot 4:3. Like, I was watching it yesterday and I was spotting all these gorgeous, like, he's almost like forcing the frame into 4:3 in so many ways, using the space. So it's kind of like this amazing thing of a movie that's really expansive and it's widescreen and it's gorgeous, but it's also claustrophobic, and you've got darkness creeping in from the corners. And Freddie Francis was talking about that, about trying to almost make the film not feel widescreen by always having the frame dropping off to darkness at the edges, so it feels almost like vignetted, like you're focusing in on the central point of attention, or they've got that control of where your eye goes. And I think all of that, like that kind of, there's a kind of wooziness to the cinematography, and the way that visually the ideas are communicated, that starts to make the house itself feel like this psychological space. He uses this kind of this filtration, which gives a kind of like slightly this kind of slightly woozy quality, or he plays with things like the exposure dropping. Literally, the house becomes more shadowy and more filled with secrets as it goes along. It becomes a darker movie. At the beginning, it's kind of bright and all the windows are open, and she's coming through the fields, and she's meeting the girl in the field, and everything's it's bright and idyllic. And as the movie goes on, it feels like you're getting constricted.
Yeah, and you see it reflected in the sound design, and you see it reflected in the costuming as well. She begins, sort of wearing light, airy sort of dresses, right? And then by the end of it, she looks like Miss
Jessel. Yeah.
Yep. Jessel. Yeah, she's Miss Jessel. Yeah, she's wearing dark, and of course, young Martin Stevens as Miles begins to look like Quint, with his steely gaze. Talk to me a little bit about the sound design, because you talked about being like girded for this like clashing of Miklos Rosa's score and this big kind of dramatic thing for this film. He doesn't do that, and in fact he uses like cues like birds or flies buzzing, particularly whenever. So talk to me about that. Talk to me about the sound design in the Innocence.
The flies are a really interesting one. Like I noticed that a lot this last time watching it, that anytime we're in a scare sequence, or we kind of imagine the presence of Quint, you've got this kind of buzzing fly in the soundtrack. So it's almost like the decay is making its way into the movie, and it's kind of like it's fun. It's fun because it exists in this world that's so kind of that's so uptight and codified, and they're talking about things, but they're not talking about things. But there's this kind of, even as they're skirting the subject, or they're not talking about the kind of the true kind of terror that's going on underneath. You've got this buzzing fly, this little reminder of the rot that's setting in beneath everything they're trying to pretend is is as it should be. So there's I think using sound design in that kind of subtle psychological way is something that I wouldn't associate with the time. And also talking like I was talking about, the way that it uses silence almost like James Wan or like a modern filmmaker would use like a loud noise, like it's because it's almost the opposite, like the place where you expect big booming orchestra. The first time you see Miss Jezzel, all the sound almost cuts out. You see her walking across the hallway, and she's cloaked in the darkness, and you almost don't register her, and the scene goes on. Everything drops out. It's like that great there's that great scene in The Birds, which doesn't have any soundtrack, where they go and see the man who's had his eyes pecked out, and Hitchcock does the same thing, where the camera jumps in 1, 2, 3 times, and on the third time all the audio cuts out. And so you're the place where you expect to be kind of like cattle prodded, you're left just with your own anxiety for that moment. So it's a really modern way of doing it.
Yeah, I love what you're talking about with the sort of sense like you're in a diving bell or you're in an aquarium, you're stuck inside of this thing. And the sound, when it cuts out like that, there's nothing more lonesome than being in a silent place, right? There's nothing more claustrophobic than being under like fathoms of water or whatever that feels like, where you're drowning. And there's so much in this film to me that suggests, and not trying to solve the movie, because it's a haunted house movie, whether or not the ghosts are real. Yes. But there's so much about this film that suggests this really like sexual frustration leading to this hallucinogenic sort of panic, if you will. I don't want to use hysteria because it's such a misogynistic term, but in the context of the Victorian novel, there's certainly, I think, an element of that. Can you talk a little bit about Freud and sex and Miss Giddens and her obvious attraction to Michael Redgrave? I mean, who isn't? Yeah. But it's a little bit about that element in this movie. That Truman Capote obviously is the person who's teasing all of this out. Yeah.
And I think it's a very funny movie as well at times, and I think a lot of that comes from how playful Capote's script is. But it's a hard one to know exactly how to talk about, because there's so much like what's suggested in a few of the moments is so dark and kind of like playfully depraved, which is what I love about it as well. It's almost like I heard when Jack Clayton handed in the script, or like showed the script to the to Fox, they kind of like brought up the kiss, and they were like, "What does this mean?" And he was like, and he just kind of like gaslit them. It was like, I don't know, like, and it was so the kind of the connotations of that was so kind of like unspeakable that nobody said anything, and it was allowed in the movie. And there's this really intense, uncomfortable, disturbing psychosexual thing going on that I mean, let's just say it, she's this sexually oppressed woman who's having these very inappropriate feelings about a man who a man who kind of enjoyed the carnal things in life, who's now maybe living in this young boy. And that's just as a relationship, and the way that she plays it, and the kind of the way that she clearly likes the compliments this little boy is giving her, but then pushes them back. Everything is unspoken. It's there. It's right on the surface, but it's so unspeakable that it's at the same time subtle and like melodramatic, which I love about this movie.
Yeah, it reminds me of Birth, the great. Yes. I mean, I love that film so much. But there's the sense of the unspeakable kind of pings against this Freudian sense of the uncanny as well, which is with the double and with the everything seems as it should be, but then something's not quite right. Like that's not my mother, and that's not my father, and that's not my whatever. And so, when these two
that's not an adult, even though he's dressing that way, and even though he's acting that way, all the mannerisms as such.
And what a stroke of genius to cast Martin Stevens as the as the old before his time Miles. He was a star because of Village of the Damned, which appeared before this, the Wolfrilla. He plays the lead evil alien kid. Spoiler alert, again, you should have seen it by now. But yeah, he had a whole little tiny career, Martin Stevens, here as Haley Joel Osment, essentially. Of his time. The other child actor, Pamela Franklin, this was her first film. She had a minor career after this. She was in, I think, the prime of Miss Jane Brodie. She, both are, I think, really remarkably well cast. I especially love the moment where she says, "Look, it's a beautiful spider. It's eating a moth." So talk a little bit about those images of decay. You mentioned decay and everything, but everything that's falling down, right? Including like when she brushes past the roses and the petals.
Yes, and the petals fall off.
Everything here is dead.
And everything beautiful is fragile. Everything is kind of like Innocence is defined by the possibility of it being ruined. So it's this thing that needs to be, because there's also this element of these kids are like these kids are totally cut off from the rest of the world as well. So they're being kind of they're being locked away in this place with no kind of guiding force about how to be apart from these like really like fucked up toxic values that their governess is like projecting onto them. And we as well as the audience are like invited to project that on them when they're whispering and they're playing. Like, are they conspiring? Are they just being kids? It's kind of taking things taking innocent actions and corrupting them through this context that that the movie is kind of forcing on us, and that the governess is kind of starting to imagine or maybe not imagine. And
I think it's here that the casting of Deborah Carr is so brilliant because she's 40 in this film.
Yes.
The governess in the Henry James is 20, and so having a 40-year-old actress, talk a little bit about how that is actually, in my mind, I think it is, but how that affects the play of the character, how we read the character as a 40-year-old rather than a 20-year-old.
I think it maybe gives more of a pull between this kind of expected maternal instinct and this kind of repressed sexual thing that's going on as well. The kind of the way that she kind of chooses to burden herself with, like, that scene with Michael Redgrave at the beginning where he basically says, "I don't want anything to do with this. Its sole responsibility lies on you." And the idea of that being like the expected thing that she kind of dives in and just kind of, it almost just seems like she decides that like this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to make these children my entire life. And so it becomes then preserving their innocence then becomes her entire world. And that kind of intensity, I think it plays differently with an actress that old, and an actress as well who's kind of whose beliefs are so kind of compounded and so her view of the world seems totally kind of locked in, and everything that disagrees with that pushed right down. So to see that unravel, I think, is more satisfying with an older actress.
I totally agree, and I think the frustration is more pointed too. I mean, she's not married. She's got some kind of history. She seems, what is it? She's sexually frustrated. I think with Truman Capote, you could read this almost as a queer text in some ways as well. This idea of being forced into a box, a sexual box that you're not comfortable with, having to hide, being frustrated with your, there's all of these elements that you could explore. And I think that's one of the beauties of the Innocence, right? It's like it is a rich text, a deep well. You can pull out all of this stuff.
Yeah. Have you seen just thinking about it, have you seen Saint Maud?
Yes.
Yeah, wouldn't that would be an interesting side by side as well, especially with the different ages of the characters.
Absolutely. And Rose Glass, that the young Welsh director, I think it's her first movie. Having a young woman direct this versus Truman Capote and Freddie Francis and based on a Henry James, it would be fascinating to have those comparisons too about those two stories. And Saint Maud is a great comparison too, because half of her life is a dream world. Right. She's completely unreliable as a narrator, if you will, right? And the film becomes unreliable as a consequence to it, just like I think The Innocence becomes unreliable at a certain point.
And I think they've got a similar, like I think as well, I think Saint Maud is a really funny film as well. It's a really knowing film, and it plays with that kind of unreliable narrator in the same way that The Innocence does. And like The Innocence, like they almost end in the same place, except The Innocence doesn't have a flash of the burning reality that it's like the end. That's what's so interesting about the ending, is whether in her mind she's performed this exorcism almost, or whether just exactly where we sit. I mean, whereas Rose goes for you should all see Saint Maud. Let's not talk any more about the ending, but it's a very interesting comparison.
Yeah, I love the way that The Innocence works, in the sense that you talk about an exorcism and stuff, but she's not exorcising like a literal demon. It seems like she's exorcising a sexual demon, or the idea of sex corrupting the children. That's the one thing that she's saving them from. Like what she's saying, all I wanted to do was save the children. She says that over and over and over again. From what? What is she saving them from exactly? It's sex, right? It's the knowledge of sex. It's the she's trying to slap the apple out of their hand when they're trying to eat it in the garden. She's like, no, you will forever be children. You'll only ever be children. You can only be children. And she kind of gaslights them. It's like the demon panic, the satanic panic. She's like, shall I tell you who put those thoughts in him? Shall I tell you? I tell you? And she's like telling them what she's like putting all these nasty thoughts into
and she's almost a perpetual child, or a perpetual teenager, just teetering on the brink. Like the way, that's what's so lovely about the way that she plays those moments, like with Michael Redgrave, where he's clearly, and the blocking is so beautiful as well, as he kind of circles her and gets ever closer and leans on the back of her chair, and it's almost like seduces her into the idea of it, and the way that she kind of responds to that kind of affection and human touch as well. There's this great motif running through the movie of hands. It starts with the hands. There are constant close-ups of the hands being warmed by the fire. There's this amazing shot that I noticed yesterday of when Miles and her are alone in the house, and he says, there's a man in the house, come on, my lady, and he holds out his hand in this very grown-up way, and she reaches out to this very adult gesture, and just as she's about to grab it, he flicks the jelly, and he's a kid again, and it's that bubble is burst, and there's this kind of like this imagery of connection through the hands.
And Daria mentioned when we were talking about this earlier that's one of her favorite scenes, because I'm not sure why it's one of hers, but it's one of mine because it's so gross. Just like flicking jelly is gross, and also to the point that Daria made is it's such a fertile animal. I mean, sex is in everything in this movie. Right? There's like, gross! Don't ever flick a jelly rabbit at me. There's something really provocative and disgusting about the sexuality in this film. It's made to seem.
And it's playful. It's playful, and that's why I think there's the scene where she's the scene that you spoke about has the overhead shot of her turning around and hearing the voices that may not be in her head. And there's a great shot where it's like I was watching it with my friend yesterday who'd never seen it before, and there's that bit where the wind is blowing and the kind of like tassel on the window is like tapping against the window at the same time as in the background she's saying. Just love me in this like orgasmic way. It's like it's so kind of playful and provocative, this film.
Well, and the curtain rod is phallic. It's like a little acorn on the end of it. And right before that, at the beginning of that scene with the just love me tapping, at the very beginning of it, the two children are rocking a hobby horse in the attic. It's all super gross. It's super playful and also super gross. And
that's what I mean. That's what I mean about this like lovely balance of like I think there are so many subtleties to this movie, but it's also really overt as well, which I love in this really playful way.
It's brilliant. It really nails sex, which is also biological and disgusting, and also playful and fun. It's these things that are in sort of eternal tension that Capote is bringing out,
and also. and also a class thing as well, like the kind of the way that they're constantly referring to Michael Redgrave as he's a man about town, he's a man who likes his pleasures, you know, the way that sex is codified as well, versus Quint, who's a working class guy who's, you know, whose sex must be wrong, and this corrupting force and something evil that's made its way into the house, that's infected this house, which belongs to a guy who's you know, who's probably seeing a different woman every night, but that's fine because that's different. It's different. And we talk about it in a different way. It's like the way that sex is codified as well is so much part of the film.
I feel like we could go on for another hour, but before we do, we should probably see if there's some questions from our esteemed audience today for Mr. Savage.
Yeah, let's see. Aurora asks, what societal and political changes took us from Shirley Temple and Andy Rooney to Village of the Damned and the Bad Seed?
Do you want to tackle the societal changes?
No, fuck, you take that one.
You know, I think we see this generational metamorphosis happen a few times, you know, during the course of our histories. But you know, we have a culture, like, you know, who idealizes children. It still does, and, you know, puts them in a certain place. You know, the truth that we now know about Shirley Temple and Andy Rooney is, especially Andy Rooney, it's pretty sordid. You know, that whole thing is a lie. Judy Garland, you know, during that period as well. But we want to portray things in a certain way, and there's always a blowback from it. So the way that we portray the nuclear family in the 40s as propaganda, and then the 50s as sort of a capitalist propaganda, begins to really backlash in the 60s. So, you know, this thing that I've told several times, and it's I'm old, I just tell the same things over and over again. But, you know, there's an author named Ethan Warden who wrote a book called Medium Cool about the films of the 1960s. And he has this phrase that's beautiful. He says, like, in the 1950s, if you're the wild one or rebel without a cause, you know, you could raise all the hell you wanted, but you listen to Mother at the end of it. You know, if you didn't listen to Mother, society would be ruined. In 1960, if you listen to Mother, you're a psycho. So a door really closed between the 1950s and the 1960s, where we began to portray, you know, the sons and daughters of Ozzie and Harriet and Leave It to Beaver, right, as Jimi Hendrix and Janis Joplin. It's such a huge, stark shifting in our cultural values, and it begins right at the very beginning of the 1960s. Anthony Perkins plays Norman Bates, which is a really good son. He's going to take on the family business. Everyone knows the boy's best friend is his mother. He's such an idealized, you know, Rick Nelson sort of character, right? Turns out to be, he wears a dress and kills women. You know, it's such a deep betrayal of the expectation of the 1950s. And throughout the 1960s, like, you know, Breakfast at Tiffany's, 1961, another adaptation of Truman Capote. We all think of it as this really beautiful, light, sort of romantic. They're two prostitutes, her and George Peppard, who are living by themselves in New York, who find each other. Yeah, the Apartment is 1961. 1, 2, 3. All of these movies are super dark sexually, super dark about culture and capitalism. We're coming to real sort of cultural moment here, and I think The Innocence is one of those unspoken ones about that too, or Village of the Damned even. And we have another sea change between 1960 and 1970, where, you know, the Bad Seeds and the Rosemary's Babies of the 1960s become, you know, the Reagan McNeils, and you know, the daughter who eats her mother in Night of the Living Dead. You have this evolution of bad children, and I think it's depending on the source of it, tells you where we are as a culture. You know, and I've spoken too much, but I think that's part of, you know, what we're looking at when we look at this evolution of how children are portrayed. Like even today, like last week we watched Melody, the great Alan Parker written, you know, film that was much bigger in Japan than in the UK or the US, which is a really interesting analog to this movie, because in both films, although one is very happy and sweet and the other is not, there's rituals of childhood that the adults are worried about and afraid of. You know, the children are off doing something strange and they're conspiring to, you know, to use your word, Rob, and we don't understand children. You don't understand, they're terrible, says Miss Giddens. They're awful. They're evil. They're dark. And, you know, there's a fine line between how adorable kids are and how terrifying they are, because they're unknowable. And I think films of the 60s and the 70s especially begin to let that erupt a little bit in a different way.
What he said.
Okay. Right. Other questions?
Okay, so Andrew in the chat, not this Andrew, Rob, you were talking about the aspect ratio and silence in this film, and given what he knows about Dawn of the Deaf and your Zoom horror film Host, can you speak a bit on how you find inspiration in such restrictions?
Yeah, I think it's something. When I started making Host, the Zoom movie. I kind of spoke a lot about this with the people I was bringing on about setting up the world of the movie, the parameters of the movie, and using that almost like weaponizing that almost against the audience. Like one of the things that we were thinking when we went into Host is that people are going to watch this in a certain context. They're going to know we made it during lockdown. They're going to know we can only. They're going to assume that we can only pull off so much. They're going to assume that it's going to be something with paranormal activity level scares, where maybe we've got a bit of fishing wire and we've made a door slam, and which I was interested in doing. But the idea with Host, and I spoke about the Innocence, and I showed for different scenes in Host, I'd show clips from movies beforehand to the actors to get them in the right state of mind. And I show in some of the early scenes where the hauntings were just starting, I showed the hide and seek scene from the Innocence as well as a few others. A few more of those kind of classic ghost story clips. And one of the things that I was wanting to do was set the audience off thinking that they were living in a world of paranormal activity level scares, where they needed to be searching the frame for these little subtle scares, and something will move, and something will shift, or there'll be a sound. And then in the third act of the movie, to really just kind of like weaponize that against them and go for much bigger, much more kind of abrasive, much more intense, like sustained intensity in the third act. So almost like prepare the audience for something and then push them into something they're totally not prepared for. And I think that's something that as a horror filmmaker you can really play with. And like the Innocence kind of does it. It's that, if it was on a chart, it'd be this, and then the intensity at the end is so incredible. It's really kind of arresting, and it kind of like it takes you by surprise. So I think, even though Clayton's not a horror movie director, his grasp of the language of horror is amazing.
So, I mean, really briefly about Jack Clayton, he had a really kind of tragic, I think, career, especially given how talented he was. And a lot of it had to do with how prickly a personality by many accounts he was. But he, his first film was Room at the Top, The Innocence, Pumpkin Eater, Our Mother's House. You must see all four of those movies. They are all masterpieces in their way. Particularly Our Mother's House is a movie that's ripe for rediscovery. One of the best movies I've ever seen. And then he went to Hollywood and he made The Great Gatsby for Paramount in 1974. That's the one with Mia Farrow and Robert Redford. And it was really critically panned, and it made it a little bit difficult for him to sort of launch some other stuff. And he was asked to do, because he's prickly, right? He was asked to do Alien, and he refused. He was asked to do The Tenant, and he really loved that novel, and he loved the story, and he was developing The Tenant. He was taking so long about it that they gave it to Roman Polanski, and he was really upset about that. He was developing Casualties of War, which eventually was made by Brian De Palma. So he had all of these like lost dreams, and somewhere between The Great Gatsby and his next film, he had a stroke, which left him without speech for 5 years. So he lost that big chunk of time. In 1983, he made Something Wicked This Way Comes from a script by Ray Bradbury that they'd worked on together. Bradbury had to cut it down from 240 pages to 120 or whatever. They made, by all accounts, this really moody, dark, as you can imagine, story about childhood and time lost, just like he's been making with with Pumpkin Eater and Our Mother's House and Innocence as well. And it got boulderized by the studio, Disney, which said, no, we're Disney. And so they recut it. They put a new soundtrack on it. They added scenes that were a little bit less creepy, and they shortened it by quite a lot. So they must release the Clayton cut at some point. I'm championing.
Yeah, hashtag.
But, so he made that, and then he had two other films. He made The Lonely Passion of Judith Hearn, which is really good, and he made Memento Mori, which was a BBC Screen 2 film, and that was it. He only made 6, 7, 8 films during the course of his life. Jack Clayton, one of the grandmasters, I think. But because of the sort of checkered, box office, especially in the United States past, only recently is being kind of recovered as such. People like Spielberg talking about him. People like
Yeah.
You know, the Haunting of Bly Manor on Netflix, the Mike Flanagan, is a remake essentially of Turn of the Screw, including using, you know, that song that they composed for this, Willow Whaley. You know, and so now he's being kind of resurrected now.
Yeah.
But when we go back and watch it, like, you know, you see how it's really the source of so many of our modern frights. All
yeah.
right. Other questions? We have time for a couple more.
Have you just while you're talking? I didn't know he did a BBC TV movie, but just while we're talking about it, did you ever watch the BBC Christmas ghost stories that they used to put on, like, like the Signalman, and there's another great one which would be a really good one to pair with the Innocence. There's this, I can't remember the filmmaker who did the Signalman, but there are lots of great filmmakers that just worked solely within British TV around.
They're freaking terrifying. I have no idea how they could ever be broadcast. I mean, is that the stuff you were brought up on? This like kind of unreleasable on television?
No,
stuff?
I only got round to it. I only got round to it recently. It was a lockdown discovery. I had the box set, the Christmas Ghost Stories box set. But I mean, I'd seen the Signalman, which is just amazing and elegant, and just all the things that a lot of British TV isn't these days. But there's I'll send it you outside of this. But there's a great the director who did the Signalman followed it up with this witchcraft themed, this modern witchcraft story, which would be a really interesting one to look at next to the Innocence.
Yeah, Ash Tree.
No, it's called. It's a single word. It's like, I'll find it and send it.
Stigma.
Yeah, which is my favorite of those.
Yeah, Lawrence Clark.
Yes.
Yeah.
Absolute master.
Yeah, he is. That's for next time. We should have you back for Halloween. We'll talk about the BBC Christmas frights. Other questions?
Let's see. We had some questions about the influence of Freud on the movie. We had some questions about how Capote approached sexually subversive themes within the script, but you guys kind of already touched on that. Is there anything else you'd like to say on that? I was kind of curious about how individuals interpreting the movie. Like, I know it's left ambiguous, but do you have a particular interpretation that you prefer over another?
Well, I'll start by saying that critics at the time largely didn't love it. You know, I think the New York Times gave it a very sort of mediocre to low review, and the opinion largely was that this stuffy British director was just a craftsman. You know, he wasn't really an auteur, you know, which was an idea that was beginning to take some hold in America in the 1960s. And it's I think a shame, because it's like those initial reactions to stuff like Innocence and Pumpkin Eater and stuff sort of shaped our conversation about this director, you know, ever more. And it's not fair, because there's actually such a wealth of great films done by him.
Do you think there's something about, because people referring to the film as just a technical exercise, or him as just a craftsman? Do you think there's something about the fact that what the movie is actually delving into is something that was unspeakable, you know, in a lot of ways, like to actually kind of like delve into that stuff would take acknowledging it, and like there's almost people weren't ready to acknowledge the kind of just the depth of this movie.
Yeah, I think undoubtedly, you know, and I think whenever we are confronted with something that makes us uncomfortable on a very kind of chthonic kind of way, we find explanations for why we're uncomfortable, because we're not ready to really kind of psychoanalyze and unpack the reasons that we're uncomfortable. You know, if Brokeback Mountain makes me really angry, I can either go out and say I'm super mad about, you know, cowboys, or I can really begin to examine why it is that I'm so afraid of watching homosexuality depicted. By the same token, to your point, I think, you know, as a culture, still we're so sexually repressed. You know, I don't think we have anything on the British in terms of that, but you know, this idea that we if we're confronted with these themes and these images and that which cannot be spoken, whether it's incest or pedophilia or necrophilia in this movie at the end, we tend to be like, oh, I feel gross. It's because the movie's not very good. No, you feel gross because the movie worked. You know, because the movie is exactly pinioning and dissecting the stuff that you don't want to deal with. It's if you let it be, it's a good therapy session.
How did you interpret the kiss at the end? I'd be so interested to hear.
Well, I feel like it's almost like a little fairy tale thing, you know, a dark fairy tale. She's trying to wake Sleeping Beauty at the very end of it. But certainly there's this like,
Almost like it's almost like the kiss is like any kind of potential for sexuality has been removed from it because he's this perfect dead thing. He's innocent again in death. So it's almost like a kind of a mirror of that kid. That's that really uncomfortable first kiss.
Yes.
That she kind of like the way that she reacts to that, just her performance and her face and the mixture of emotions and like, shit, maybe that was her first kiss ever. And like, it's this kind of weird, passionate, it's such an interesting to like that and that final image.
I love that read because, you know, finally here's a safe sexual object.
Yes.
Here's a safe place to put her, you know, feelings, her naughty feelings, and it's a corpse of a child. Yes, it's disgusting. Okay, so we've gone a little bit over time. I apologize. It's a great way to close. Child necrophilia. Okay, we're gonna watch. The short film that I was talking about. It's only 2 minutes long. It's directed by Mr. Savage here. It's called Salt. It's unbelievable. I want to thank you, everybody, for being here. And Rob, thank you so much for your time, for choosing.
Oh, thank you. This was so much fun.
All right, we're going to watch Salt. Thank you, everybody.
It's okay. Smell the roses. Then blow out the candles. Sweetheart, I'm gonna have to go downstairs.